Dr. Farid, you have 5 minutes.
Chairman, Chairwoman, ranking members, and members of both subcommittees, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. Technology, as you've already heard, and the internet have had a remarkable impact on our lives and society. Many educational, entertaining, and inspiring things have emerged from the past 2 decades in innovation, but at the same time, many horrific things have emerged. A massive proliferation of child sexual abuse material, the recruitment and radicalization of domestic and international terrorists, the distribution of illegal and deadly drugs, the proliferation of mis- and disinformation campaigns designed to sow civil unrest, incite violence, and disrupt democratic elections, the proliferation of dangerous, hateful, and deadly conspiracy theories, the routine and daily harassment of women and underrepresented groups in the forms of threats of sexual violence and revenge and non-consensual pornography, small and large-scale fraud, and spectacular failures to protect our personal and sensitive data. How in 20 short years did we go from the promise of the internet to democratize access to knowledge and make the world more understanding and enlightened to this litany of daily horrors? A combination of naivete, ideology, willful ignorance, and a mentality of growth at all costs have led the titans of tech to fail to install proper safeguards on their services. The problem that we face today, however, is not new. As early as 2003, it was well known that the internet was a boon for child predators. Despite early warnings, the technology sector dragged their feet through the early and mid-2000s and did not respond to the known problems at the time, nor did they put in place the proper safeguards to contend with what should have been the anticipated problems that we face today. In defense of the technology sector, they are contending with an unprecedented amount of data. Some 500 hours of video are uploaded to YouTube every minute, some 1 billion daily uploads to Facebook, and some 500 million tweets per day. On the other hand, these same companies have had over a decade to get their houses in order and have simply failed to do so. And at the same time, they have managed to profit handsomely by harnessing the scale and volume of the data that's uploaded to their services every day. And these services don't seem to have trouble dealing with unwanted material when it serves their interests. They routinely and quite effectively remove copyright infringement. And they effectively remove legal adult pornography because otherwise their services would be littered with pornography, scaring away advertisers. During his 2008 congressional testimony, Mr. Zuckerberg repeatedly invoked artificial intelligence, AI, as the savior for content moderation, and we are told 5 to 10 years. Putting aside that it's not clear what we should do in the intervening decade or so, this claim is almost certainly overly optimistic. So for example, earlier this year, Facebook's chief technology officer showcased Facebook's latest AI technology for discriminating images of broccoli from images of marijuana. Despite all of the latest advances in AI and pattern recognition, this system is only able to perform the task with an average accuracy of 91%. This means that approximately 1 in 10 times, the system is simply wrong. At a scale of 1 billion uploads a day, this technology cannot possibly automatically moderate content. And this discrimination task is surely much easier than the task of identifying a broad class of child exploitation, extremism, and disinformation material. The promise of AI is just that, a promise. And we cannot wait a decade or more with the hope that AI will improve by some 9 orders of magnitude when it might be able to contend with automatic online content moderation. To complicate things even more, earlier this year, Mr. Zuckerberg announced that Facebook is implementing end-to-end encryption on its services, preventing anyone, the government, Facebook, from seeing the contents of any communications. Blindly implementing end-to-end encryption will make it even more difficult to contend with the litany of abuses that I enumerated at the opening of my remarks. We can and we must do better when it comes to contending with some of the most violent, harmful, dangerous, and hateful content online. I simply reject the naysayers that argue that it is too difficult from a policy or technological perspective, or those that say that reasonable and responsible content moderation will lead to the stifling of an open exchange of ideas. Thank you, and I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Farid. Well, we've concluded our openings. We're going to move to member questions. Each member will have 5 minutes to ask questions of our witnesses, and I will start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Well, I have to say, when I said at the beginning of my remarks, this is a complex issue. It's a very complex issue, and I think we've all heard the problems. What we need to hear is solutions. Let me just start by asking all of you, just by a show of hands, who thinks that online platforms could do a better job of moderating their content on their websites? So that's unanimous, and I agree, and I think it's important to note that we all recognize that content moderation online is lacking in a number of ways, and that we all need to address this issue better. And if not you who are the platforms and the experts in this technology, and you put that on our shoulders, you may see a law that you don't like very much, and that has a lot of unintended consequences for the internet. So I would say to all of you, you need to do a better job. You need to have an industry getting together and discussing better ways to do this.
Okay, how do we go in to the platform and say we have got to enforce this because we don't want this stuff flowing in from China, and how do we do that?
Yeah, well, this is what the conversation is. So I'm with everybody else on the panel. We don't repeal 230, but we make it a responsibility, not a right. If your platform can be weaponized in the way that we have seen across the board from the litany of things that I had in my opening remarks, surely something is not working. If I can find on Google in page one, and not just me, my colleagues on the table also, investigative journalists, we know this content is there. It's not hiding. It's not difficult. And we have to ask the question is that if a reasonable person can find this content, surely Google, with its resources, can find it as well. And now what is the responsibility? And I think you said earlier, too, is that you should just enforce your terms of service. So if we don't want to talk about 230, let's talk about terms of service. The terms of service of most of the major platforms are actually pretty good. It's just that they don't really do very much to enforce them in a clear, consistent, and transparent way.
Well, thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, my time's expired, and I yield back.
I do want to get to Dr. Farid with the same thing. So we would welcome concrete suggestions.
Thank you. I agree with my colleague, Professor Citron. I think 230 should be a privilege, not a right. You have to show that you're doing reasonable content moderation. I think we should be worried about the small startups. If we start regulating now, the ecosystem will become even more monopolistic. So we have to think about how do we make carve-outs for small platforms who can now compete where these companies did not have to deal with that regulatory pressure. And the last thing I will say is the rules have to be clear, consistent, and transparent.
Thank you.
There's two issues at hand here. When you do moderation, you risk over-moderating or under-moderating.
Right.
What I would argue is we are way, way under-moderating. Right. When I look at where we fall down and where we make mistakes and take down content we shouldn't, and I weigh that against 45 million pieces of content just last year to NCMEC and child abuse material and terrorism and drugs, the weights are imbalanced. We have to sort of rebalance, and we have to try to get it right. We are going to make mistakes, but we're making way more mistakes on allowing content right now than we are on not allowing.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr.
Mr. Farid, in your testimony, you talk about the tension at tech companies between the motivation to maximize amount of time online on their platforms on the one hand, and on the other hand, content moderation. Could you talk about that briefly, please?
So we've been talking a lot about 230, and that's an important conversation, but there is another tension point here, and there is another thing, which is the underlying business model of Silicon Valley today is not to sell a product. You are the product. Right. And in some ways, that's where a lot of the tension is coming from, because the metrics we use at these companies for success is how many users and how long do they stay on the platforms. You can see why that is fundamentally in tension with removing users, removing content. And so the business model is also an issue, and the way we deal with privacy of user data is also an issue here. Because if the business model is monetizing your data, well then I need to feed you information. There is a reason why we call it the rabbit hole effect on YouTube. There is a reason why if you start watching certain types of videos of children or conspiracies or extremism, you are fed more and more and more of that content down the rabbit hole. And so there is real tension there, and it's the bottom line. It's not just ideological. We're talking about the underlying profits. I gotta say this is a source of incredible frustration. So first of all, I was part of the team that developed PhotoDNA back in 2008 with Microsoft. And I will tell you, for an industry that prides itself on rapid and aggressive development, there has been no tools in the last decade that have gone beyond PhotoDNA. That is pathetic. That is truly pathetic when we are talking about this kind of material. How does an industry that prides itself on innovation say, we are going to use 10-year-old technology to combat some of the most gut-wrenching, heartbreaking content online? It is completely inexcusable. This is not a technological limitation. This is, we are simply not putting the effort into developing and deploying the tools.
And let me just share that having watched some of these videos, it is something you never want to see and you cannot get out of your mind.
I agree.
Dr. Farid, do you have any thoughts on how this should be addressed from a technological perspective?
I want to start by saying, when you hear about the moderation that is happening today, we've heard it from Google, we've heard it from Reddit, you should understand that that has only come after intense pressure. It has come from pressure from advertisers, it has come from pressure on Capitol Hill, it has come from pressure in the EU, and it has come from pressure from the press. So there's bad news, there's bad PR, and then we start getting serious. For years, we have been struggling with the social media companies to do more about extremism and terrorism online, and we have hit a hard wall. And then the EU started putting pressure. Capitol Hill started putting pressure. Advertisers started putting pressure, and we started getting responses. And I think this is exactly what this conversation is about, is what is the underlying motivating factor? The self-regulation of trust us, we will do everything is not working. So the pressure has to come from other avenues. And I think putting pressure by modest changes to CDA 230 is the right direction. And I agree with Ms. Oyama, is that if these are good actors, then they should encourage that change and help us clean up and deal with the problems that we are dealing. But I do, I've been in this fight for over a decade now, and it's a very consistent pattern. You deny the problem exists, you minimize the extent of it, you deny the technology exists, and eventually you get enough pressure, and then we start making changes. I think we should just skip to the end part of that and just recognize that we can do better, and let's just start doing better.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
How do we ensure that content moderation doesn't become censorship and a violation of our First Amendment?
Good. So the way we have been thinking about content moderation is a collaboration between humans and computers. So what computers are very good at doing is the same thing over and over and over again. But what they're not good at still is nuance and subtlety and complexity and inference and context. So the way content moderation works today, for example, in the child sexual abuse space, is human moderators say, this is a child, this is sexually explicit, we fingerprint that content, and then we remove very specifically and very targeted that piece of content. False alarm rates for PhotoDNA that we developed a decade ago are about 1 in 50 billion. That's the scale you need to be operating at. So if you are going to deploy technology, you have to be at a very high, automatic technology, you have to be operating at a very high scale. And so the computers can't do that on their own, so we need more human moderators. You heard from Google, 10,000 moderators. There are 500 hours of video uploaded a minute. That is not enough moderators. You can do the arithmetic yourself. Those moderators would have to be looking at hours and hours of video per hour, so we have to also beef up our human moderation.
Okay, thank you. And Ms. Oyama, I look forward to seeing you in Montana, and I yield back.
Dr. Farid, can you describe some of the challenges with moderation by algorithm, including possible bias?
Yeah. So I think you're absolutely right, Congresswoman. When we automate at the scale of the internet, we are going to have problems, and we've already seen that. We know, for example, that face recognition does much, much worse on women, on people of color, than it does on white men. The problem with the automatic moderation is that it doesn't work at scale. When you are talking about billions of uploads, and if your algorithm is 99% accurate, which is very, very good, you are still making 1 in 100 mistakes. That is literally tens of millions of mistakes a day you're going to be making at the scale of the internet. And so the underlying idea that we can fully automate this, not to take on the responsibility and the expense of hiring human moderators, simply doesn't work. And so I fear that we have moved too far to the give us time to find the AI algorithms, and because we don't want to hire the human moderators because of the expense. And we know today that that is not going to work in the next year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. And it's a little bit worse than that because it also assumes an adversary that is not adapting. And we know that the adversaries can adapt. So we know, for example, that all machine learning and AI algorithms today that are meant to identify content are vulnerable to what are called adversarial attacks. You can add small amounts of content to the information, and you can completely fool the systems.